At 2:41 a.m., my phone rang with my grandfather's name, and the fear in his voice snapped me fully awake. He begged me not to go to work the next morning, saying the building I worked in was about to fail. He wasn't guessing. He was certain. I had one choice: trust him and risk my career, or ignore him and walk straight into something I'd never escape. By sunrise, the news would prove which choice meant life, and which meant everything collapsing. Before I tell you how that single phone call changed everything, and why ignoring it would have ended my life, do me a small favor. Support this story by subscribing to the channel and dropping a comment about where you're watching from. It helps these real moments reach the people who need them most. My name is Caleb Moore. I was 31 years old then, living in a rented apartment on the east side of Ridgeport City, married just under 2 years, and expecting my first child. On paper, my life looked stable. Promising, even. I worked as a financial risk analyst at Halcyon Plaza, a 50-story glass tower planted in the heart of the business district. It was the kind of building people admired from the street and trusted without question, modern, intelligent, covered in sensors and certifications that promised safety. The man who called me that night was my grandfather, Walter Knox. He was 84 years old. A retired structural foreman who'd spent 4 decades building the bones of Ridgeport: bridges, tunnels, parking decks, foundations no one ever noticed unless something went wrong. He didn't panic. He didn't exaggerate. In my entire life, he had called me in the middle of the night exactly 3 times. Every one of those calls came before disaster. That's why my chest tightened the moment I heard his voice shaking through the speaker. "Caleb," he said, breath uneven. "You need to promise me something. Don't go to work tomorrow." I sat upright in bed, already awake now, already alert. Beside me, my wife Lena stirred, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach, where our unborn child rested. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Are you hurt? Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm outside your building," he said. That froze me. I slid out of bed and crossed to the window. 8 floors down, across the street, I saw the hazard lights of his old pickup flashing in the dark. "You drove here," I whispered. "It's almost 3 in the morning." "I needed to see your face when you promised," he said. "I can't explain everything over the phone." I didn't even put on shoes. The elevator ride down felt endless. My mind raced through explanations I didn't want to believe: confusion, grief, maybe age finally catching up to him. Since my grandmother passed, everyone had been watching him closely, waiting for signs. But when I stepped into the night air and saw him standing there, jacket thrown over pajama pants, hair uncombed, hands shaking, I felt something colder than doubt. "This isn't about your health, is it?" I asked quietly. He grabbed my shoulders. His grip was still strong, but unsteady. "That tower you work in," he said. "It's wrong." I frowned. "Wrong how?" "I walked the underground levels tonight," he said. "The support columns. The way the weight transfers. The sound when you press against the concrete. It's under stress it shouldn't be carrying." I exhaled slowly. "Grandpa, it's a new building. 5 years old. Fully monitored." "Monitored by machines," he snapped. "Not by hands. Not by instinct. I've stood inside failing structures before, Caleb. I know the sound. I know the feel. That building is screaming." I wanted to argue. I wanted logic to win. Promotions, presentations, months of work, all of it waited for me in that tower the next morning. But standing there, looking into his eyes, I remembered something. When I was 12, he'd yanked me backward off a job site without explanation. Seconds later, a suspended load snapped free and crushed the exact spot where I'd been standing. He never guessed. He knew. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll stay home tomorrow." The relief that washed over his face nearly broke me. Back upstairs, Lena listened quietly as I told her everything. She didn't interrupt. She didn't dismiss him. "Call in sick," she said simply. "We can't afford to ignore this." At 4:02 a.m., I emailed my manager. "Food poisoning. Report attached. Apologies." I hated myself for the relief I felt when I hit send. The morning came quietly. Too quietly. The city woke up as it always did. Traffic built. Coffee brewed. The skyline glowed gold. At 8:43 a.m., Lena screamed from the kitchen. I ran to her just as she turned her phone toward me. "Breaking news: Halcyon Plaza collapses during morning hours." The words didn't register at first. Then the image appeared. Where my workplace had stood, where my desk sat on the 46th floor, there was nothing but smoke, twisted steel, and screaming sirens. My legs gave out. I should have been there. I would have been there. And that was only the beginning of what that call revealed, because what came next forced us to confront a truth far more disturbing than a collapsing building. And it would expose why my grandfather was the only one who knew it was coming. The hours after the collapse blurred together into a haze of sirens, breaking news banners, and phone calls that never seemed to stop. Every network showed the same footage on repeat, Halcyon Plaza folding inward on itself like a stack of cards, 50 floors collapsing straight down in less than 15 seconds. Analysts kept calling it catastrophic structural failure, but none of them could explain how a building that young, that advanced, could simply give up. I sat on the edge of our couch, my laptop still open to the presentation I had prepared for that morning. My name was on the title slide. My fingerprints were all over the work that would never be presented. Lena stood beside me, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping the back of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. My phone buzzed nonstop. Coworkers. Clients. Numbers I didn't recognize. Then a message came through that cut deeper than the rest. Caleb, this is Aaron. Have you heard from Marcus? Marcus sat 2 desks down from me. He joked the night before about beating me to the office to steal my good chair. I tried calling him. Straight to voicemail. Another message arrived. This is Nolan's wife. He went in early today. Please tell me you've heard something. My chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. Then my phone rang again, this time, a number I recognized instantly. Caleb, my father said, voice breaking. We're on the way to you. Your grandfather is with us. An hour later, my parents' car screeched into the parking lot. My mother rushed inside and wrapped her arms around me so tightly I could barely stand. My father followed, helping Walter inside. He looked smaller than he had the night before. Not weaker, just older. They're saying evacuation started, I said quickly. They're saying people got out. Walter nodded slowly. I called emergency services at 6. Told them what I saw. They didn't believe me at first, but enough maintenance workers had reported vibrations. They sent an inspector. The news anchor confirmed it seconds later. Authorities state an emergency evacuation began at approximately 8:15 a.m. following an early morning structural warning. Officials estimate nearly 1,800 people were able to exit the building before collapse. 1,800. But not everyone. I dropped my face into my hands. This is my fault, I said. If I hadn't asked Marcus to grab my files. Walter grabbed my wrists, forcing me to look at him. No, he said firmly. Listen to me. You staying home gave me time. That time saved lives. My phone rang again. Marcus. I answered so fast I nearly dropped it. I'm alive, he gasped. I was in the stairwell when the alarms went off. 5th floor when it came down. I don't know how I made it. Relief hit me so hard I had to sit down. Then came more calls. Some alive. Some not. By nightfall, the confirmed death count stood at 146. The building had collapsed exactly the way Walter described, foundation failure triggered by water damage in the underground levels. A ruptured municipal pipe had been leaking for over a year. The experimental concrete mix used during construction had degraded silently, slowly. The building sensors read it as normal settling. Walter read it as a death sentence. Within days, investigators swarmed the site. The developer issued statements. Inspectors backtracked. Engineers argued on live television. And suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to the 84-year-old retired foreman who had called in a warning hours before the collapse. Walter refused every interview. I didn't do anything heroic, he told me quietly one afternoon as we sat at the kitchen table. I just listened. The city didn't see it that way. Families of survivors began reaching out. Some cried. Some thanked him. Some simply needed to understand why their loved ones lived while others didn't. At the memorial service, rows of white chairs filled the park near the river. 1 chair for each life lost. 146 reasons the city would never be the same. I stood beside Walter as people approached him one by one. A woman with shaking hands clasped his. My husband worked on the 29th floor. He followed the evacuation order because of you. A young man hugged him wordlessly, tears soaking into Walter's jacket. But for every thank you, there was another silence. Another name etched into stone. Walter carried all of them. The investigation moved fast after that. Faster than I expected. And then, 2 weeks later, something surfaced that changed everything. A junior engineer leaked internal emails from Halcyon Development Group. Messages showing cost overruns. Pressure to meet deadlines. A decision to ignore early warning signs because the sensors hadn't flagged anything critical. The public outrage was immediate. But what chilled me wasn't negligence. It was intent. Buried in those emails was a memo, one that mentioned Walter by name. A complaint filed years earlier. A construction delay he'd forced on another project. A reputation for overreacting. He's old school, the email read. Let him complain. The data will protect us. Walter had been dismissed before. Ignored. The building didn't ignore him. And when subpoenas started flying, when arrests followed, when the truth finally clawed its way into daylight, I realized something else. That call at 2:41 a.m. hadn't just saved my life. It had exposed a system that only listened to numbers, until people started dying. But the most unsettling part? Walter wasn't done talking. Because a week after the collapse, while the city mourned and the media moved on, he said something to me that I still haven't forgotten. "This wasn't the first time I saw it," he said quietly. "And it won't be the last." And that was when I understood. Halcyon Plaza wasn't an accident. It was a warning. The city tried to move on. After the memorials ended and the candles burned out, officials shifted their language from grief to logistics. Cleanup timelines. Zoning reviews. Press conferences designed to reassure people that Halcyon Plaza had been a tragic anomaly, not a symptom of something rotten beneath the skyline. But Walter didn't move on. Neither did I. 3 days after the first arrests were announced, he asked me to drive him downtown. Not to the site of the collapse, he refused to go near it, but to a low concrete building near the river that housed the municipal archives. "I need to see something," he said. "Something I should have looked at years ago." The archive smelled like dust and paper and old neglect. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as a clerk led us to a long table stacked with folders tied in faded red string. "These are permits and inspection records for high-rises approved in the last 20 years, she said. "You're lucky. Most people don't ask for these." Walter's hands trembled, not from age, but from anger, as he untied the first bundle. He didn't read fast. He read carefully. Dates. Signatures. Concrete mix specifications. Inspection overrides. His jaw tightened. "Caleb," he said quietly. "This pattern, it's repeating." He slid the documents toward me. 3 buildings. Different developers. Different engineers. Same experimental concrete mix. Same sensor thresholds. Same municipal approval stamps. And the same pressure, he added. Deadlines. Budgets. Quiet warnings brushed aside. I felt cold despite the stale warmth of the room. "How many?" I asked. Walter exhaled slowly. "At least 5 still standing." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every glass tower I'd once admired now felt like a loaded gun waiting for a trigger. I saw cracks where others saw reflections. I heard silence where Walter heard strain. And then the calls started. First, a woman named Elise. Her brother survived Halcyon Plaza. She worked as a civil engineer across town. "I overheard something," she said. "A meeting. They're rushing inspections on another site. They're afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of you," she answered. "Of your grandfather." Word spread faster than the truth ever had. Developers began issuing statements, carefully worded, legally insulated. City officials promised audits. Panels were formed. Committees assembled. But quietly, people started listening. Maintenance workers sent photos anonymously. Engineers forwarded reports they'd been told to bury. A security guard left a voicemail describing vibrations in a parking structure that felt wrong. Walter listened to all of it. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't speculate. He filtered. "This one's nothing," he'd say, handing back a report. "This one, keep watching." Then, one evening, he went silent. We were sitting at the kitchen table, paperwork spread out between us, when he froze mid-sentence. "There," he said softly. "That's it." "What?" I leaned in. "The East Foundation," he murmured. "Same pattern. Same water infiltration." "Which building?" I asked. Walter swallowed. "Ardent Tower." My stomach dropped. Ardent Tower was still under construction. And my company, my former company, was contracted to provide risk modeling for it. "I worked on that," I said. "The numbers were clean." Walter looked at me with something between sorrow and resolve. "The numbers don't feel," he said. "People do. We didn't go public. Not yet." Instead, Walter made one call, to a man named Elias Crown, an old rival from his construction days who now ran an independent safety oversight firm. Crown listened. Asked questions. Requested documents. Then he said something that made my skin prickle. "You're right," Crown said. "And they know it." 2 days later, an unmarked car started parking outside Walter's house. The first time, we dismissed it. The second time, Walter noted the plates. The third time, the driver got out. A man in a tailored coat approached the porch and handed Walter an envelope. Inside was a settlement offer. 7 figures. No explanation. No signature. Just a note. "Let the past rest." Walter didn't hesitate. He tore it in half and handed it back. "I already buried too many people," he said. "I'm not burying the truth." That night, my phone rang at midnight. Unknown number. "You should convince him to stop," the voice said calmly. "Accidents happen. They don't need to multiply. Who is this? I demanded. Silence. Then a click. I didn't tell Walter. Not immediately. But the next morning, when inspectors finally shut down Arden Tower Midpore, the city erupted again. News helicopters circled. Workers poured out. Engineers refused interviews. And suddenly, the narrative shifted. This wasn't about one building anymore. It was about how many warnings had been ignored, and who had ignored them. The city council called an emergency session. Walter was invited to speak. He didn't want to. I'm not a politician, he said. You don't have to be, I replied. You just have to tell the truth. The chamber was packed. Developers sat stiff-backed in suits. Engineers avoided eye contact. Families of halcyon victims filled the gallery. Walter stood slowly, gripping the podium. I've spent my life building things, he began. And I've learned one thing: everything gives warnings before it fails. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He explained. Cracks. Water. Wait. Silence. When he finished, the room didn't erupt. It went quiet. Too quiet. Because everyone there understood the same thing. Halcyon Plaza hadn't been unpredictable. It had been convenient. And the cost of convenience had names. As we left the chamber, Walter leaned heavily on my arm. They won't forgive this, he said. I know, I replied. He looked at me, eyes sharp despite the years. That's fine, he said. I didn't do this to be forgiven. And for the first time since the collapse, I realized. The danger wasn't over. It was just changing shape. After Walter spoke at the council chamber, the city split cleanly down the middle. On one side were the people who wanted answers. Families who had lost someone. Workers who had felt vibrations under their feet and been told they were imagining things. Inspectors who were tired of being overruled by budgets and deadlines. On the other side were the people with too much to lose. By the next morning, every major outlet was running some version of the same headline. Retired foreman claims more buildings at risk. Some called Walter a hero. Others called him reckless. One editorial suggested grief had clouded his professional judgment. That one made my hands shake. Walter read it silently at the kitchen table, folded the paper, and placed it beside his coffee. They always do that first, he said calmly. Discredit the messenger. Makes it easier to ignore the message. The pressure came fast after that. Elias Crown called to warn us. Someone pulled my firm's insurance coverage overnight, he said. No explanation. Just gone. A city inspector we'd been working with suddenly stopped answering calls. Another texted once, just once, to say he'd been reassigned and couldn't talk anymore. Then the subpoenas started. Not for the developers. For Walter. They demanded old project records. Deposition requests. Clarifications about statements he'd made 20 years ago. It was a fishing expedition, designed to exhaust him, to bury him under paperwork and doubt. I watched it wear on him. Not fear, anger. They're not trying to prove I'm wrong, he said one night as we sat surrounded by boxes of documents. They're trying to make me tired enough to stop. You won't, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. I might, he admitted quietly. If it were just me. That's when I understood the real danger. Walter didn't care about his reputation. He didn't care about money. He didn't even care about his own safety as much as he pretended to. He cared about me. About Tessa. About the baby coming into a world where corners were cut and warnings ignored. And that meant they had leverage. The first threat came disguised as concern. A social worker showed up unannounced, citing an anonymous tip about unstable influences around our household. She was polite. Professional. Asked questions about stress levels, about Walter's late-night patrols, about my decision to leave my job. She left without incident. But the message was clear. That night, Tessa cried for the first time since the collapse. They're not even hiding it, she whispered. They're telling us to be quiet. I felt something harden in my chest. We won't, I said. But saying it and surviving it were different things. The breakthrough came from a place none of us expected. A junior structural engineer named Malik showed up at Walter's door just after midnight. He looked barely older than me, eyes sunken, hands shaking. I can't live with it anymore, he said. He worked for North Point Development, the primary firm behind Halcyon Plaza and Arden Tower. They knew, Malik said, voice breaking. Not after the fact. Before. They ran simulations that showed progressive failure if water exposure continued past a certain threshold. Why wasn't it reported? I asked. He laughed bitterly. Because the cost of remediation was higher than the cost of settlements. Walter closed his eyes. Malik handed us a flash drive. Everything's here, he said. Internal emails. Revised sensor tolerances. Inspection overrides. They moved the red line so alarms wouldn't trigger. Why come to us? I asked. Because you're not negotiating, he said. And because your grandfather listens when buildings talk. Malik didn't stay long. He left like someone who knew he wouldn't be welcome anywhere again. We copied the files immediately and sent encrypted backups to 3 separate locations. By dawn, we had proof. Real proof. Names. Dates. Decisions. And suddenly, the city's tone changed again. Because evidence doesn't argue. It accuses. The district attorney announced a formal criminal investigation into North Point Development and 2 affiliated inspection agencies. Federal oversight followed within 48 hours. Ardent Tower was officially condemned before construction could resume. 4 other buildings were evacuated pending review. Walter watched the news in silence. You did it, I said. You stopped it. He shook his head. We slowed it, he replied. Stopping it means consequences. Those came the following week. North Point CEO resigned for personal reasons. 2 city officials were placed on administrative leave. Lawsuits flooded the courts. And then, quietly, the counterattack began. A motion was filed accusing Walter of inciting panic and economic damage. They wanted him held liable for losses incurred due to halted construction. It was absurd. And dangerous. If this sticks, Elias warned, it sets a precedent. Anyone who raises a warning can be punished for being right. The hearing was scheduled quickly. Too quickly. The night before, Walter didn't sleep. Neither did I. We sat in the living room with the lights off, the city glowing beyond the windows. Promise me something, he said suddenly. What? If they try to make this about you, your job, your future, you walk away. No, I said immediately. Caleb, he said gently. I've lived my life. You're just starting yours. I thought about the phone call at 2:41 a.m. The terror in his voice. The certainty. If you hadn't called, I said quietly, I wouldn't be here. This isn't just your fight. He studied me for a long time, then nodded once. Then we finish it properly. The hearing was packed. Media. Lawyers. Observers from 3 states. North Point's attorneys spoke first. They talked about panic, speculation, damage to investor confidence. Then Walter stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He walked the court through the timeline. The cracks. The water. The ignored warnings. The documents Malik provided. Then he said something that made the room still. I didn't imagine the failure, he said. I recognized it. And if recognizing danger is a crime, then every firefighter, every engineer, every parent who pulls a child back from the street is guilty. The judge recessed for an hour. When she returned, she dismissed the motion entirely. And referred North Point's legal team for obstruction review. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. Walter ignored them all. He just put a hand on my shoulder and said, let's go home. That night, the unmarked car disappeared. So did the calls. The city began rebuilding, not towers, but trust. New inspection protocols were introduced. Independent oversight mandated. Sensor thresholds reset nationwide. They called it reform. Walter called it, finally listening. A month later, our son was born. We named him Owen. Walter held him with hands that had once lifted steel beams and now trembled with something gentler. Pay attention, he whispered to him. The world always warns you before it breaks. As I watched them together, I realized something. The collapse hadn't just exposed concrete and corruption. It had exposed what happens when experience is ignored, and what happens when someone refuses to stay silent. And though the danger had passed, the lesson never would. Because somewhere, someday, another building would start to whisper. And someone would need to listen. The city moved on faster than I expected. Memorials faded into plaques. News segments shortened from minutes to seconds. The words, unprecedented failure, became just another phrase recycled whenever budgets were discussed. But for us, nothing ever really went back to normal. Walter changed after the hearings. Not in the way people feared. He didn't withdraw. He didn't grow bitter. He became quieter, more deliberate, as if every word now carried weight he refused to waste. He stopped driving the city at night. Instead, people came to him. Inspectors. Engineers. Even students from the technical college across the river. They sat at our kitchen table, notebooks open, listening as Walter explained how to hear what data couldn't show. Buildings don't fail suddenly, he'd tell them. They fail politely. Slowly. They ask for help long before they scream. One afternoon, a woman named Carla knocked on our door. She worked in municipal records. She didn't come inside. She just handed me a folder and said, I think this belongs with the truth. Inside were zoning variances signed off years ago. Variances that allowed reduced safety margins in exchange for innovative materials. The same materials used in Meridian Tower. Northpoint hadn't been the only one. Walter didn't look surprised. They never are, he said. The second wave of investigations followed. Smaller firms. Older buildings. Quiet settlements that never made the news. But repairs were made. Reinforcements installed. Evacuations ordered before tragedy could strike. No headlines. No applause. Just absence of disaster. And that, Walter said, was the real victory. I found my own path in the aftermath. I never went back to corporate finance. The thought of glass towers and sealed boardrooms made my chest tighten. Instead, I started consulting independently, risk assessment, ethical forecasting, helping municipalities model worst-case scenarios instead of best-case profits. It paid less. It mattered more. Tessa returned to her work slowly after Owen was born. She chose smaller projects, insisted on safety audits, walked away from 2 lucrative contracts when corners were being cut. We argued about money sometimes. We never argued about priorities. Walter became something the media didn't know how to label. Not a hero. Not a whistleblower. Just a man who wouldn't stop paying attention. The city council offered him an advisory role. He declined. A university offered him a named lecture series. He accepted on one condition: no fees, no sponsorships, no donors influencing content. They agreed. The first lecture was standing room only. He didn't show slides. He didn't use jargon. He brought a chunk of cracked concrete and set it on the podium. This, he said, tapping it lightly, is what ignoring whispers looks like. The room stayed silent long after he finished. There were consequences too. Northpoint's former executives avoided prison through settlements, but their names were barred from public contracts. A few city officials resigned quietly. Others disappeared into consulting roles far from scrutiny. Walter watched all of it with a strange calm. Justice isn't loud, he told me one evening as we sat on the balcony, Owen asleep between us. It's structural. You only notice it when it's missing. On the 1-year anniversary of the collapse, the memorial park opened. 153 trees. 153 names. We walked the path slowly. Families left flowers. Some cried. Some just stood with hands in pockets, staring at plaques like they were trying to memorize something important. Walter stopped at the edge of the park, not going in. You don't have to, I said. I know, he replied. But I do. He touched each tree as he passed. Not lingering. Just acknowledging. When we reached the last one, he stood still for a long time. I still hear it, he said quietly. Hear what? The day it happened. The building. It stopped whispering right before it fell. I didn't know what to say. Neither did he. Time did what time always does. It softened edges. Left outlines. Owen grew. Laughed. Learned to walk gripping Walter's fingers like they were unbreakable anchors. Sometimes, late at night, Walter would stand by the window again. But now, instead of fear, there was something like peace in his posture. You still listening? I asked him once. Always, he said. But now I trust the city to listen too. That was the biggest change. Not laws. Not protocols. Attention. People questioned reports. Workers spoke up. Inspectors pushed back. And when someone old, tired, or inconvenient raised a concern, fewer people laughed. Not none. But fewer. One night, my phone buzzed at 1:58 a.m. I froze. Then smiled. It was Walter. Relax, he said when I answered. Just wanted to tell you, that bridge renovation on 5th Street? They postponed it. Found stress fractures. I exhaled slowly. Good, I said. Yeah, he replied. Very good. I looked at Owen sleeping peacefully in his crib. At Tessa breathing softly beside me. At the quiet city beyond our windows. And I understood something I hadn't before. The call that saved my life wasn't about fear. It was about love refusing to stay silent. About experience demanding respect. About paying attention when it would be easier not to. And if there's one thing this story taught me, it's this. Disasters don't begin with collapse. They begin with warnings ignored. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is listening when someone you trust says, something's wrong. If my story made you pause, think, or look differently at the world around you, take a moment to support it. Share it with someone who trusts their instincts but doubts themselves. Leave a comment about a time intuition, or someone who cared, kept you safe. And subscribe to the channel so more true stories like this can reach the people who need to hear them most.